Good morning, and thank you once again for joining me this Thursday on The Conversation with Kelly Diamond. You can catch me every week at 6:30 Pacific Time or 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Also, my written word rolls out every Monday on globalwealthprotection.com. Okay, so lots of drama in the movement. More kernels of corn than we're used to processing in our bowels. So, I guess I wanted to address the issue of what happened with Brad Spangler, and he really is just an example. So this isn't about Brad per se as a person as much as it is of how I always envisioned a stateless society to handle violent crimes. So I wanted to start off and preface all of this by saying, and there are no caveats. This is not a but clause. Okay, this is a declaration. I find any violation of a human being to be of the utmost depraved and reprehensible act anybody could make. Anything, it's one thing to say I stole a loaf of bread. While that is still a violation of property right, and while that is still a violation against the person and the owner of the bread, I could still understand why a starving man would steal bread. Okay. I get that. I can wrap my head around the circumstance. I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying it's okay to steal. I'm simply saying I can get it. Most people can. Most people can at least understand it. They might not think it's okay, but they get it. When it comes to violating a person, their actual physical being, on the other hand, and initiating that kind of violence and violating that person in that way, be it assault, murder, rape, molestation, any of those things. That's where we've crossed into a territory where I cannot wrap my head around it. And it goes from reasoning to rationalizing. It goes from, a starving man stealing food, you get that. It's okay. There's definitely some causation or correlation between the act, between the act and the circumstances, versus trying to come up with psychological rationalizations for why somebody is so fucked up and broken that they would do what they did. Okay. And feel little or no compunction about it at the time. Or even if they did feel compunction and they still did it anyway, that they're able to overcome that feeling of compunction and still do it. It all becomes psychobabble to me. Okay. I condemn it. I condemn it in any way that I could possibly express now, or in words that I don't yet know. I condemn it to that extent. Okay. There's no question about it. But much like any other discussion I have with statists, okay, just because I'm not willing to vote for your measure doesn't mean that I don't care about the issue. I want to be very clear on that. I've told people several times I don't vote, and that I oppose certain measures that fall under the noble umbrella of education for children, health care for people, measures to help the poor. Look, those are very noble things, but I won't vote for those measures. Oh, so you don't care about education? You don't care about the poor? You don't care about the indigent? You don't care about these issues? Oh, you mean to tell me that if I don't vote for this particular measure to address it in this particular way, then I mustn't care about the issue at all? That's the logic. Okay? And what I'm hearing right now within the movement is that if I don't agree with the measures that certain people advocate on how to address violent criminals such as rapists and child molesters, then I mustn't really care about the issue of molesting and raping people. Right. That's the faulty logic behind a lot of the arguments that I've heard. And I'm sorely disappointed in a lot of people, because up to now, I've stood shoulder to shoulder with many of these people making arguments about how there is no distinction between taxation and theft, And yet now I see them, viciously trying to dig out a moat, a linguistic moat between murder and retribution, or murder and vengeance. The same people who agree that there is no semantic distinction between taxation and theft, all of a sudden are trying to carve out a distinction between murder and vengeance. The reality is that murder is an act and vengeance is an impetus to the very act. Okay. It's quite simple. But I condemn what Brad Spangler did. Okay. And I wrote down a few notes because I want to try and cover as much as I can. What he did was wrong. Child molestation is wrong. Right? Put it right here. Its own little event or series of events or behaviors. And I'll put that here. Set it aside. Brad Spangler happened to also do a lot of good work on the side. Okay. Outside of being a child molester, he also did some admirable things, which is why people feel so betrayed, right? He extended more from the libertarian left, but nonetheless, he was a fairly vocal person for liberty, for a stateless society, and he started the Center for a Stateless Society. He had, in terms of just how he advocated for liberty, people admired him. Right? That is its own separate little behaviors over here. Okay. Those good behaviors do not negate the bad behaviors, and the bad behaviors don't negate the good behaviors. They're mutually exclusive. He did not atone for what he did to his daughter by doing good things over here for other people. It's no different than, a member of the church molesting children and then going over and helping feed the poor. They don't cancel each other out. They don't negate one another. Either way, helping the poor was still a good thing. And he still did those things. Right? But he also still molested a child. Right? So they're mutually exclusive. They neither cancel each other out, nor do they negate one another. They exist separately. Likewise, okay, what Brad Spangler did is mutually exclusive of what other people are calling to do to him. If we are to agree that child molestation is wrong, that violating a human being is wrong, so child molestation, rape, assault, abuse, physical abuse, murder, if we are to agree that there is no place in a civilized society for those things, right? That far and wide, at all four corners that we can see, as far as the eye can see, there is no place in a civilized society for those behaviors. And we can, without question, unequivocally, and without stuttering, say that child molestation is wrong, absolutely wrong, with no exception. And we could say that about murder, we could say that about rape, and we could say that about abuse. If we can say that about those things, then where on earth does the idea of a death penalty, a lynch mob, or violent retribution come into play? We just established there's no place in a civilized society for all this violence, and then no sooner do you draw your second breath do I hear people say and call for violence against Brad Spangler. The same people who have stood shoulder to shoulder with me on thread after thread on Facebook, advocating individualism, all of a sudden decided to socialize victimhood? Wow, a tiny little piece of shit meets a fan and you ideologically jump out of a 10-story window? Well, aren't we some fair weather anarchists? Can you still say that you want a stateless society? Because when I hear about socializing victimhood, I think, what about the greater good? Right? That's the first argument that comes out of their mouth. You can't help it, because that is your argument. That's what it's all predicated on. We have to kill them. Why? For the greater good. Oh, well, back to the state then, because that's why the state does what it does, right? Everything is done for the greater good. Individual rights are constantly cast aside for the greater good. So now this confession comes out, but I think it's like 10 or 11 years later, after the fact. And the people who admired Brad, befriended him, are sorely disappointed, feel totally betrayed, and are absolutely disgusted and insulted and offended by this confession that he's made, this public confession that he's made. And in all of that, while understandable, doesn't make you a victim. Being offended doesn't make you a victim. Yes, the same people, once again, who are standing shoulder to shoulder with me about how personal feelings are not an excuse to mitigate free speech and censor yourself. All of these anarcho-libertarian brutalists, all of a sudden, are putting their feels out there as an argument and a justification for why it makes sense to call for violence against Brad Spangler. Because, hey, nothing says let's fix violence like more violence, right? Hey, the United States is stopping the war by having a war. Remember how well that argument went over? Yeah, when we talk about it in foreign policy, the argument seems to make a lot of sense. But when we talk about it in terms of individuals within our society, apparently we can't deal with it in a humane way. People calling for Brad Spangler to be raped in jail, to take his own life, for him to be murdered, get out your pitchforks and torches. Oh, you found your virtual courage, did you? Well, congratulations. Because these are the same people who are posting about how cops are raping people, and I don't hear them calling them out by name saying, yeah, we should go lynch his ass and hang him by his nuts. We just weep about how there's no justice in the system and how he's going to get away with it without so much as an indictment. But I don't hear people with enough courage to call a cop out by their name and demand that he take his own life, that he be attacked. I'll kick your ass. I'll fuck you up. I'll kill you myself. None of that. No, I don't see that. Only Brad. We'll do it within the private sector, right? We keep our private shit within the private sector. Because God forbid a cop would actually see that, trace it back to your ass, and fuck you up, right? Right now we're picking on Brad. It's so easy to be so dismissive of somebody like Brad. There's a whole registry. Wherever the fuck you are in the United States, there's a whole registry of registered sex offenders that you could have easily gone out and lynched yourself. And you didn't. And you still won't. Because the difference is that while you talk a big game and like to flex your nuts on the internet, all this violence that you so desire to impose and inflict upon other people for whatever reason will be met with violence. And you know that. The difference is that if it's met with violence, that's called self-defense. Calling for the murder of Brad Spangler, calling for the rape of Brad Spangler, or anybody, any sex offender, is calling for a criminal act that you find reprehensible, that you were just saying was wrong. Otherwise, you're saying there is a place in society for murderers. There is a place in society for rapists. So basically, what you want is a GIMP in a basement, prepared to do your bidding to the people that you find disgusting. We have to keep a few disgusting, morally depraved assholes in a basement, just in case we need them to address other morally depraved people that are outside the basement. This is what I've been hearing. Okay, there is absolutely no reason or logic to it. And what is even more upsetting is that in all of this, we're worried about the virtual feels of Brad's followers, never once considering what the victim would want. I have spent years addressing the issue of how would you deal with sex offenders and how would you deal with murderers in a stateless society. Okay? And I've spent years trying to cultivate an answer that makes sense. And at the end of the day, I can tell you what I would want, but I can't tell you what other people would want. And in the case of this situation, I know that I am not a victim of Brad Spangler. Therefore, I am in no position to make any demands on him or impose anything on him as if I were. Right? So, here we have a group of people calling for retribution, vengeance, right? Because they find his behavior to be reprehensible. As I do, only I'm not calling for more violence. Then there's a group of people who believe that this is about the victim. Well, go fucking figure. Here we are arguing this whole time about no victim, no crime. But in this case, there is a crime because there is a victim, but we don't give a fuck about what the victim thinks or wants. Amazing. Sold ourselves out within seconds. It's fucking amazing. So, in a stateless society, I maintain that the victim decides how to define the debt and how it should be paid back. Killing Brad Spangler, as I've heard it quite intelligently put, is like declaring bankruptcy on a debt. If I owe you $1,000 and I declare bankruptcy, I'm forgiven the $1,000. Yeah, sure, okay. My credit score takes a nosedive, but what difference does it make? I don't owe you the 1,000. You don't get the 1,000 ever. Right? So you never get restored. You don't get your restitution of $1,000, the debt that I owed you, because I declared bankruptcy. It's a coward's way out, right? And likewise, so is death. If calling for Brad Spangler's death might atone for your hurt and offended feelings, which, by the way, hurting your feelings and offending your sensibilities unto itself is not a fucking crime, I might add. Broadening the scope of victimhood in such a way trivializes and disrespects people who are actually victims of a violent crime. So check yourself. But Brad Spangler owes a debt to his victim, or victims, as the case may be. I don't know. I've met a couple, and this is completely anecdotal, okay? This has nothing to do with establishing statistics. It's simply to call out the fact that if we're going to argue individualism as being a paramount value to collectivism, then let us call out a few individual cases. Okay. I went to university in UC Santa Cruz, and I took a self-defense course. Yeah, you know, not martial arts, just a defense course. In the event that if I were attacked while walking to class or something like that, or going to downtown, that I would be able to, one, prepare myself, and B, know what to do, or at least have a fighting chance. A lot of people take these self-defense courses. Well, anyway, the person who was instructing that course, that little series, was in fact a rape victim. Okay? And she said as much. And she said, one of the worst things about being raped is losing control. That in those moments, you have no control over your situation. And so I committed myself to helping other women never have to experience that loss of control. Yes, being violated was a terrible experience unto itself, but when you realize that you have no control over the situation, you've already suffered. That's already enough to break you. And it was very upsetting, and the hardest part was overcoming that. And so her way of coping, her way of addressing that, was to not only learn how to defend herself to prevent that from happening again, right, but to share that information with other people. Of course, the natural assumption is that she wanted her assailant dead, which was actually very far from the truth. She felt sorry for him, if you can believe it. She didn't want him to die. She didn't want him to be raped as well. And interestingly enough, neither does Brad's daughter, apparently, according to her own open letter to the internet. She said she would never wish this on anybody. So you have these victims who are saying, no, 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 we are not addressing violence with violence. But apparently, there are some who can't respect the wishes of the victim. We can't respect that. I'm sorry. I'm too offended right now by what was done to you and that's really more important than what happened to you, right? My feels are really important. Actually, they're more important. So sorry that you don't want this violence. I want it because I need to, my feelings. Right. We're not trying to make victims whole, apparently. This idea of justice and making victims whole was burned at the stake. That was the kindling for the stake so that we could later strap Brad to it, apparently, in the public square. Some people need to be burned in the public square. Some people need to be stoned and hung in the public square. Wow. Really? Some people need that? Who? Are you going to be the one to do it? And under what circumstances? Who decides? Exactly. If molesting a child is wrong, and here, let's get really graphic, because I want to know where the line is. So you just stop me when you find that line, okay? If a man putting his penis in a child is wrong, is it equally wrong if he doesn't use his penis and only uses his hands? Oh, of course it is, Kelly. That's fucking disgusting. What kind of question is that? Just asking. Just want to know. Okay, so using his hands is still wrong. What if they didn't sexually violate the child? They only struck the child with the same hands. But instead of finger banging the kid, they smack the kid around. Is that equally as bad? Well, child abuse is wrong. Of course it's wrong. All abuse is wrong. Okay. All right. What about spanking? You know, the crutch that people use when they can't use their words. We spank. Right? Discipline. Is that okay? Have we crossed the line yet? Have we crossed over from the death penalty to to each their own? Interesting, right? What about just verbal abuse? Is that, yeah? Have we now officially gotten to a good place, comfortable place where we don't need to interfere and our sensibilities are okay? Okay. So, Brad Spangler was wrong. And to say the very least, he was very clumsy on how he went about trying to address it and confess it. And perhaps it was self-serving, all right? And many claim that it was insensitive of him towards the victim to out her this way, right? It was even suggested that, well, it would have been okay for him to do that if it was part of the restitution, which of course offended everybody all over again and fired up this whole big fucking brouhaha. But it makes sense that that a victim might want their aggressor to publicly own up to what they've done. Because the one thing that happened is that there's only one person who knows and acknowledges that it happened, and that's the victim. The aggressor is still in denial. Okay? The aggressor is still saying, there's nothing wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. What happened? Nothing happened. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, it's your word against mine. Right? They're still hiding. And so it continues to remove that power and control from the victim. If the victim still has no control over how they receive restitution, then we continue to victimize the victim. We perpetuate that feeling of no control over my circumstances. It's bad enough they couldn't control their circumstances, but now we're going to perpetuate it in the name of justice, okay, and safety. We're going to once again compromise the victim's control over their situation and say, you have no say over how you are made whole. We'll tell you how to make you whole. Just like your aggressor told you what you were doing that day. You're spreading your fucking legs. That's what's happening. That's the order of business. And yeah, you have certain things that you want. And that's nice. But not as important as us hanging him by his fucking thumbs. So, if it doesn't include what we want to do to him, then you're an apologist. A final note about this whole thing. This is not an ideological issue. This is not left versus right. Okay? To make it that way is to be so fucking shallow and stupid that you don't deserve the time of day or the donations on your fucking website. Victims of violent aggression and violence in general are not spoiled goods. Okay? Everything they touch, and every person they meet will not turn to shit. Okay? That's not how it works. People overcome tremendous amounts of adversity and trauma. I'd like to at least think that people who have experienced rape or have experienced some sort of violence against them can overcome these things. But this is not a left versus right issue. This is whether or not people who believe in a stateless society or aspire to a stateless society find that there is a place in society, in civilized society, for violence. Either you do or you don't. And if you do, then there is your moral inconsistency. There is where your principles fall apart. It's not about dealing in absolutes. It's about whether or not you really want to abolish centralized violence or not. And if you don't, then just say so. At which point, can you please turn in your anarchist bona fides at the door? Because you can't be trotting that shit around. You're still a fucking status and you got some shit to work out. You got some issues. I don't care if you call it community or you call it the state. At the end of the day, collectivizing violence, that's the state. I find Brad Spangler's actions to be horrible. I find the response from a lot of my stateless or supposed stateless cohorts to be equally disappointing and offensive. Eye for an eye doesn't work. That's not being civilized. That's barbarism. I'll catch you next week. Be well.